I should follow my own instruction on this to rename yourself to include your name and your organization. And then we will go ahead and get started when we have most of our task force joining us. We'll just give it one more minute.
Crystal, can you just let me know that you can hear me so that I know my headset connected?
Yep, I can hear you. I can see you. We are now recording. We're also live streaming as well.
Great, thank you.
Shoot, Chris, I meant to just let in
The waiting room is now off, so everyone will be able to just submit themselves.
Oh, okay. I think I accidentally clicked decline on somebody. Who was it? Hopefully they made it in. I think it was Joel, so I see him in here. So hopefully there was no problems. Okay, well, Crystal, you think we're ready to get going? Great. Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see you guys all here today. Thanks for joining us as always. Just a quick reminder, if you can, please rename yourself on Zoom to include both your name and your organization. It just helps us with taking notes. And we have a lot to cover today, so we're just going to go ahead and dive right in. So, we're going to skip our usual introductory slides today. You all have seen them. We know what they say. And so we're going to just start by covering what we talked about last time. So at our meeting number 10, we, as you guys recall, discussed and voted on proposals for programs for compliance, workforce, and for equity. We also deliberated and voted on a proposal for demand flexibility. And then that was really as far as we got as far as voting. So we had some time to discuss civic penalties, and then we reviewed our timeline for wrapping up these recommendations. And so today, we're really going to use today's time to wrap up our discussions from last time and get the final votes that we need from this task force out of the way so that we can focus on the public engagement feedback. So we're going to start right away with revisiting demand response. We heard from a few task force members after our last meeting and thought it worthwhile to discuss this topic offline and bring back some considerations for the task force around this topic. Once we complete demand response, we'll be talking about this suite of other proposals. Those other proposals include reviewing civic penalties, looking at beyond the 2030 for this BPS, and I believe those are the two big ones. Then we'll take a quick 5-minute break. And after the break, we will spend the last hour discussing the public feedback. Now, hopefully you all received the overview of the summary document with all of the public feedback and had a chance to really dive into the appendix where those write-in comments gave very specific feedback to the task force on the various elements of our recommendation so far. So we'll be taking you guys through a facilitated session to understand if we need to make any changes or if you all would like to lobby for any changes to our recommendations based on the public feedback we've received to date. And then we'll wrap up at the end and talk about our next steps. And then just quickly, before we dive into all the content today, wanted to remind everybody about our next steps for this, for wrapping up our recommendations. Today, we'll have our final meeting to discuss public feedback and if we want to make any changes based on that public feedback. Between now and August 10th, the Lotus and the CEO team will be working to draft our first draft of the final recommendations that we will share with you all for feedback. Each task force member will get their own version of the recommendations document. We'll ask and we'll send specific instructions on editing that document and providing your feedback within it. Note, we'll remind you of this, you are not allowed to share your comments on the draft recommendations with each other. We have to keep it separated. And then we'll ask that after 7 business days, you send us your comments and feedback on the final recommendations. We'll receive that August 19th from you all, and then we'll have a couple of weeks to turn around a final draft for you all that will then send to you on September 7th. You guys will have about a week, 5 business days to look at that, those recommendations, and then we will discuss any final changes to the recommendations document on our final task force meeting, September 14th. After we get all of your feedback from then, we will finalize the recommendations, make a final version, and send that to the AQCC and associated parties before our October 1st deadline. Are there any questions or concerns on these next steps as they're written out? If not, we'll dive into our proposal work. Okay. I'm not hearing any. So Keith, I am going to pass it to you, and just let me know when I can advance your slides.
Sure. Thank you. If you want to go ahead to slide 11, I will reintroduce myself. I'm Keith Hay. I'm the Director of Policy at the Energy Office. I work with Crystal helping to support the office's legislative agenda, but also the implementation of certain pieces of the legislation related to building decarbonization. I am also a poor stand-in for Will Tour, our executive director. I don't know if all of you have heard, but Will was not that long ago in a climbing accident and is still very much recovering from those injuries. And so I will be trying to walk you through what may be the last couple of recommendations and last couple of votes that the task force has. The first of those, let me stop there and ask, I guess, if there are any questions, and if not, I will jump into the demand response and flexibility recommendations. Seeing none, I will keep going. So coming out of the last vote and discussion of the task force, we at the Energy Office went back and thought more about the possible role of demand flexibility, and in particular, demand response. And I think I want to create a little bit of a distinction between those two things, but ultimately we have some suggested language for the task force to consider on the next slide. You know, as we move forward in time and understand that the grid here in Colorado will change, it will likely become more important to think about and to plan for the hours in the day when energy is being consumed. And so being able to shift that energy use from times of whether it's higher price to lower price or higher emissions to lower emissions will be really important, not just for the state, I think, but for building owners as well, and for building operators as well. And so we are trying to get to a place where the task force can encourage the use of demand flexibility, recognizing that it's a little bit challenging today to map shifting energy use onto the primary metric that the task force has adopted, and that's that site-specific EUI, because shifting energy use doesn't necessarily result in a lower EUI or lower energy consumption. It really is just changing it over sort of some cadence of time. That said, we think that there is a strong rationale for providing partial credit today for demand response, which does reduce the energy consumption in buildings and can reduce the site EUI, and that there is a strong relationship between the kinds of technologies and opportunities that may come forward for demand response and the long-term potential for demand flexibility. You know, candidly, we're seeing that today in a filing that Xcel Energy brought before the Public Utilities Commission, where they are starting to talk about these things in roughly synonymous ways. And that is that they're making that link between demand flexibility and demand response and the technologies that enable the two. So that's sort of the background to the recommendation that we have. But let me stop there and ask if there are any questions or if anyone else would like to offer sort of thoughts on the conversation before we step into the recommendation. Seeing none, if we can go to the next slide.
Keith, this is Kara.
Hey, Kara.
Hi, apologies, I was a little late in dialing in, but I heard, I just want to echo everything that you said and really appreciate the consideration given to demand response and today's opportunities to incorporate it as a proposal. I guess the only other kind of contextual narrative that I might add is that we have this wonderful opportunity as building owners are rethinking their buildings to upgrade for EUI improvements or electrification improvements, to also start weaving in this train of thought amidst that same retrofit effort. And so I think the hope is that we can stimulate and catalyze demand response and demand flexibility to be an integral part of retrofits starting today, recognizing that the full capabilities won't be fully recognized on the grid side for a number of years, but just seizing the opportunity to weave it into retrofit plans today, I think is important and exciting to sustain its relevance, or I guess pull up, draw forward the relevance to improvements happening today. So thanks.
And Kara, thank you for that. And I think you have a vote of support from Joel, who dropped into the chat his support for your comments. I'm not sure, since you're dialing in, that you can see those. So the approach that we're suggesting and is on this slide, I think, is consistent with the overall approach that the task force has been taking in terms of trying to provide a high level of guidance to the division and the Air Commission around what kinds of things ought to be considered or adopted as the Commission creates rule language for the BPS. And so the recommendation is to provide an alternative pathway credit for demand response programs, and that AQCC adopt language encouraging different types of demand flexibility technologies. And I think that to us is consistent overall with the approach that we've taken, and would happy to answer questions, but really submit this for a vote.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. And so I think as you guys take a read through this slide, feel free to raise your hand or unmute if you have any comments or questions or suggested changes to what we have on the slide here. And then we have about 15, 20 minutes or so for discussion. And if it doesn't take that long, it doesn't, but we can put it to a vote after we have some time to discuss. Stacey.
Hi, thanks. I think I'm in support of this proposal and even this language. I don't have anything to say against it. However, the question or concern I have is, in reading through the public comments of the survey, there seem to be lots of comments and questions or concerns that sort of reflect that folks just don't know what Energy Star Portfolio Manager is and what it does. And since that is the portal through which building owners will be essentially reporting that is generating their site EUI, if a building owner is doing some demand response and utilizing this alternative pathway, there's no way to capture that in Portfolio Manager or to express or explain that. So how then does the state think they're going to get that information or understanding from the building owners? Well, we're developing all these really cool alternative things that are important and good pathways for building owners to use. The tool through which they're reporting is not dynamic enough to capture all of those things, and it's complicated. That's just a comment, a concern maybe, but I don't have an answer.
So I heard a question in there, but before I try and help answer that, I think we had two other questions. I'm not sure if they fall in the same area or if they take us down a new direction. So perhaps if we put those on the table, I can handle one or all of them appropriately.
Paul, we'll pass it to you and then Jim after that.
I'm sorry, did you?
Yes, you first, Paul, and then we'll go to Jim afterwards.
Yeah, thanks. Very much agree with what's already been said. I think that's a great concept. To me, the challenge is how it gets implemented. We just heard some really good comments about the problems of reporting it. To me, we would have to start, in order to implement this properly, with some understanding or reporting on the characteristics of the demand at the particular building. Is it a significant enough demand that implementing demand response would make a difference? And so to me, it's hard to vote yes or no on this without really seeing the details of how it would be implemented, although I absolutely support the concept. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. Jim, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I think as long as we can have a reporting system that makes sense with a particular system that a building owner has installed or wants to install. We have a couple of systems working, for instance, and we get daily reports, and we could aggregate those to monthly or quarterly or annually. And so I think, yeah, I agree with the first comment that our experience is that this would not reduce site EUI as well. So maybe that language could get tweaked as we vote on this. And then second comment is, I think we should give credit to building owners and buildings that have a demand response system in place as their baseline, so that they don't get penalized for doing things in the last couple of years or in the next couple of years before the baseline condition reports and they start to have to do whatever they want to do.
So if I can, just following up on that last point, Jim, and then I'll come back to the questions of sort of tracking and reporting, just so that I understand. Your suggestion or recommendation would be that existing building demand response systems be credited. And I guess, we may be thinking about demand response slightly differently. You know, my background, I come out of a world where much of the demand response is run through utility programs. And so wanted just to understand sort of, I guess, one, what you mean by demand response technologies. Is that a thing that a building owner or operator is running on their own behind the meter, or is that part of a utility program? And then was that a recommendation to credit those systems?
Yeah, so we have 2 buildings now that are on a behind the meter system, and we're about ready to put a 3rd one in. And it just sheds load on a area by area basis.
And is that something that you are doing in partnership with your utility service provider, or you are doing on your own in order to avoid a demand charge, let's say?
Just on our own.
Okay. No, that's helpful. So that, I think, becomes, I would agree with you, that becomes a little more challenging perhaps, because the utility is likely not seeing that change. Joel, sorry, did you want to hop in as the utility guy here?
Sure. Well, I had kind of another comment.
Okay.
I think it is accurate that demand response programs are typically orchestrated at the utility level. And we do collect data on that type of program. The caveat that I have is that within the next 2 to 4 years, Colorado will also be joining an organized wholesale electricity market of some sort, or multiple markets. And in those cases, they also often have a demand response program administered by the market operator. That might look a little different from a utility program, but typically aggregators will aggregate buildings to participate in the market. And there might be a separate set of metrics and measurements through that route.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And certainly as we thought about the proposal language here, we were thinking first and foremost about the utility run and operated programs, and that as you know, we thought about the tracking and reporting, it would be reporting through those programs, and that would essentially serve as some form of verification that the load was avoided. I think it becomes a little more challenging to think about how we would adopt crediting for buildings that are doing this outside of a utility program. That said, I think that, as we get into it, the rulemaking process with the division, it's certainly something that we can think about how to do that. I think that there are probably a couple of different ways we could get there, but want to focus on the high level language that we have there and the recommendation to move forward with this, recognizing that there's a lot of work to be done in how that tracking and crediting would be done. Jim?
Yeah, I'm just going to volunteer to work with you or whoever to understand how we do it. And maybe that will give credence to other smaller building systems that are behind the meter. And I would also say that I think the utility programs are the lowest hanging fruit. I mean, those are usually going for the big industrial or campus users where their loads are substantial. And if they can mitigate those demand spikes from those big users, then for sure we should focus on those as a high priority.
I appreciate the offer, and we will certainly take you up on that as we move down the road of looking at what the language would look like. And Joel, I was not ignoring the fact that we may be moving to an organized wholesale market, and that will create a new set of challenges. But I think we have some runway to figure out, first of all, what that's going to look like and where we'll land before we really need to take up that piece of it. So Stacy, I'm not sure, did I ultimately address your question of sort of how we would do this? I mean, again, I think, we have a couple of different pathways, and it's going to depend on whether we're talking about the kind of system that Jim has or a utility run program. But I think we can ultimately capture those energy savings and reduced EUI in both instances. I mean, ultimately what we're trying to do is, I think, respond to the task force's desire, as I've heard it in the time that I've been with you, to create some flexibility for building owners to be able to comply, but to do it in a way that gets at the actual site EUI reductions. And we think this would be one more method.
And
Yeah, I'm not arguing that. I'm only suggesting that there's a bunch of administrative burden, and I don't know who's going to handle all that. So I just typed out a blathering message in the chat. You can keep it for the historical record. We don't have to take any more time with it here. I'm concerned on your behalf about administrative burden. Not my position, but I just think that all this nuance is really important, and people ask about it, and we need to be prepared to respond to it. But I think there's some reality that we're not really addressing. Again, maybe it's not the task force responsibility, but some of these things are going to carry a significant administrative burden for someone to figure it out. That's all. So good luck.
Appreciate that.
Thank you for that, Stacy. And we don't need to go to the next slide, Kim, but I just wanted to make a reminder that there are the alternative compliance pathways. The building owners obviously track their energy through Energy Star Portfolio Manager, but all these alternative compliance pathways will have more administrative documentation required to the energy office. So demand response is just something that is adding on to those with renewables and partial electrification. So that is something that will be considered in the rulemaking.
Katrina.
Yeah, so first, this is hard to review live in real time, and I don't think we got these slides in advance. And so I'm finding it really challenging because I just would need more time. This is complicated. I also was just trying to go back through the history on this, and I think we voted on this in meeting 8 and voted not to include demand flexibility. Not because we all don't think it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important. And I'm trying to remember what some of the concerns were. I don't sort of see them all well reflected as I try to go back through the meeting notes. So I wonder if others could recall more how that discussion had gone and how you think this proposal mitigates those. Or if Colorado Energy Office can walk through some of those, or perhaps my memory is eluding me. I think that we had decided not to include it in part because of a concern around double counting, because as utilities report on how they get to zero carbon, then this is part of how they get there. by not having to generate as much electricity. So I completely agree with every principle that this is incredibly important. I'm just not sure that the BPS is the right mechanism in place to incentivize it. And the last thing I'll add is I think that if we are going to incentivize it, we should make sure it's not just that technology has been installed, but that the building is actually enrolled in programs and participating actively in demand response programs if they're going to get any credit. So that would be, I think, a change to this language, though, again, it's very hard to do live in real time.
Yeah, I would pass to Crystal or Keith. Would you like to respond to Katrina's comment before we pass it over to Joel?
I'm happy to let Joel go and then see
Okay.
what he says in response to Katrina's comment.
Okay, great.
My comment is actually just a question on process as well. To Katrina's point, yes, we did vote on this previously. We did carry a majority in favor, but not a filibuster-proof supermajority. So, do we really need a 2/3 vote to approve adding something to our recommendations, or are we good with a simple majority?
I can actually answer that process question. Each vote we have been taking, we have been approaching it as 2/3 majority. So at the end of the last meeting, it was a 50-50 right down the middle. And so I'll throw it back to Keith on why we are re-bringing it to this meeting.
Bill?
Yeah, we voted last meeting to not include it, I think because a lot of people thought that it would not reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There are a lot of reports that you can read where it actually in a highly electric building, it can substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions, perhaps up to 40%. And so, the purpose of this legislation is reducing GHG, and I think this is perhaps one of the more important ways to do it.
Thank you. So, Katrina, I appreciate the thoughtful comments, and I think we came away from the last meeting understanding that there was a lot of difference of opinion with respect to the potential role of demand flexibility, and a lot of concern that demand flexibility might not reduce site EUI, or at least it didn't directly appear so, and that while it could shift load that would maybe result in lower emissions from a building, that didn't meet the target metric. And so given that there was some of that concern, but also a lot of support for, or 50% of support for something around demand response and demand flexibility, we went back to think about that conversation and are bringing back to you what I would call a revised and different proposal that focuses less on demand flexibility and more on the demand response side, and providing partial credit for demand response as opposed to partial credit for demand flexibility, because we do believe that the demand response piece, and I agree with you that there needs to be, that approach to verifying participation in a program or verifying, energy reduction and how to credit that into the site EUI, and happy to reflect that language here. We think it's a different proposal that I think meets a lot of the concerns that we thought were leading to a vote not to include it, and that there's included at the end of this a broad expression of, adopting language to encourage demand flexibility, but no crediting. And so we do think it's a different proposal. We do think it's slightly responsive to the concerns that were raised, and would encourage the task force to look at it in light as a new proposal and consider a new vote on it. And I'm sorry, I'm not tracking the chat, so I don't know what, I see things popping up, but I can't read them. Karen?
Yeah, I was just going to get to Bill Green's comment about it can be up to 40% in a highly electrified building. Is there data on like how good is it if you're still relying on gas generators to shift load. So I just want to make sure that it's sort of equal across the board. Anybody?
Well, if I might, Kara Carmichael wrote a great article about it that the deal is that if you can shave peak load at a time you're using a highly carbon intensive generation fuel, man, it saves a ton as opposed to a renewable resource. So that's how it saves greenhouse gases, is at peak times when you're using simple cycle gas turbines with natural gas. Those are pretty intensive. So if you can shave that peak, that's great.
And while that's true on the electric side, in Colorado, we have not traditionally had gas demand response programs. We are starting to see those emerge as proposals from utilities. And so I think there'll be opportunities to actually capture gas savings from a demand response program as well over the next couple of years.
Keith, I wanted to direct your attention to some questions in the chat. There's two. One is from Katrina about the concern about the utility claiming the GHG reductions in a demand response program. So essentially, would the state be able to attribute those GHG reductions to the building owners or to the utility, or would we be double counting?
That's a great question. And we, as the state, are currently working through the process of actually making those determinations right now. Both gas and electric demand response are part of regulated utility clean energy and clean heat plans and demand response plans. And so there is a working group at the Air Pollution Control Division that is looking at the greenhouse gas accounting related to the various types of utility programs and the attribution of the emissions reductions related to those and the interactivity of those. So I don't have an answer for you today other than to say there's a lot of really smart people across the state who are looking at this question and trying to figure out how to address that. And that will be true not just for our regulated gas utilities and electric utilities, but also Colorado Springs will be subject to that since they do file a clean heat plan.
And I'll just add to that too, is that during the rulemaking, the Air Division is aware of the statutory requirements. So all of these recommendations, they will be viewing through that filter of how do we attribute these reductions and making sure that they're not double counting. So it is definitely a concern that will be their first priority. And Katrina, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I might just say, because I agree this is really important. It can be high greenhouse gas impact. I would like us to, again, make sure that it's for enrollment in actual programs, and also make sure that maybe we state that it should avoid any double counting, because I worry that we're in a very different place on this than where the task force was going on renewables, where we require RECs and discounting of RECs, and prescribe how to avoid double counting. If we're going to say this should count and the AQCC can figure out how to avoid double counting, I wonder if we should say the same on renewables. Renewables should count and the AQCC should figure out how to avoid double counting and how that crediting works, because it's very complicated in both cases. And this seems very inconsistent with where we went on renewables as a task force. I think that's what's bothering me about it.
So I think we have, Katrina, if I may, I think the language on participation in demand response programs actually in the language that we have proposed for you. It's the end of the second full sentence and beginning of the third. I don't know if somebody from the Lotus team could highlight it. And I think we would be happy to add language around, avoiding double counting. I'm actually thinking about I don't know where it went. Can we go to slide 12? Oh no, sorry, I'm on the wrong section. Slide 12. And in the bold, it says partial site EUI credit for participation in a demand response program. So I think that if there's additional language that we should add there to help clarify your thinking happy to do that. But I think that does capture participation in a demand response program. If you wanted to add utility, I would ask the sort of thoughts of the task force members on that one, but happy to add the language on double counting.
And Keith, following up on that thread, Paul asked that, is it possible to ask the Energy Office to come back with a more specific proposal that includes implementation before we vote on this?
Well, I mean, I think we're trying to remain true to the work that we've been doing in terms of providing high-level guidance to the division that will develop the rules for submission to the Air Commission and leave the details of this to the Air Commission. I think to what I was saying earlier in response to Katrina's comments, I'd be a little hesitant to go too far down the road of trying to adopt actual rule language here, only because so much work is being done on the interactivity of electrification, gas demand response, and the accounting that I feel like we would want to leave that language till we have a better sense of where the accounting is. So I guess that's a long way of saying it would be my preference that we not do that because of the issues that are still being worked out. And I'm sorry, I think, Katrina, you still have your hand up and Jim has a hand up as well. People pop all around here. I'm getting confused.
That highlighted portion on the screen, I think we need to tweak the language a little bit because as we've discussed, we think that many demand response programs do not reduce site EUI. So that's going to be an impossible thing to achieve as a partial site EUI credit. I think we need to add some language that says it provides either that or a reduced demand for the property. Yeah, thank you.
And Katrina, and then I'll pass it to Karen. And sorry, I don't know who raised their hand first, but if that's okay, I'll pass it to Katrina first and then Karen.
Okay, yeah, I think what was throwing me about the language, Keith, was the next sentence, the further the task force recommends that the AQCC adopt language to encourage, and then it's sort of a whole list of technologies. And that sentence implies you don't necessarily have to be participating in a program. But that's the sentence I think that's throwing me. It doesn't say that you get credit, but I don't know what anyway, that's maybe that could be broken out, or there's some, yeah. We can wordsmith later. I just, yeah.
Well, I mean, to the extent that there's a desire to vote today, I'm not sure what later might mean. Happy to talk about it. I don't know, Katrina, if you're wanting 2 paragraphs or 2 recommendations, but before we go there, Karen.
Oh, I was just I tend to not like the word encourage. I'd like to, if it provides partial, or it has a impact on GHG, site EUI or whatever, then I think we should state that, but it's just encouraging, it's just that regulatory language. It's in 2 places. So I was hoping we could use something besides encourage. But
No,
Katrina,
Keith, do you want to talk more about that of why we broke out demand response versus demand flexibility, or even throw it to Kara about that?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to start and let others weigh in. Again, coming out of the last conversation, we heard a lot of concern about whether demand flexibility in and of itself would get to a reduction in site EUI, but some consideration that demand response could or would. And so we tried to craft language that would capture some of that and provide a pathway for a building owner to receive some amount of credit under the general framework of trying to provide flexibility, and therefore to put demand response into one of those alternative pathways. The Energy Office, and I think some others on this call, think that going forward, demand flexibility will also be important as a way to get emissions reductions, even if it doesn't necessarily get site EUI credit. And so came up with the proposal here that the Air Commission, encourage building owners to adopt those technologies today. That it felt like that was a reasonable response to what we were hearing coming out of the last meeting, because there was that concern that those technologies or generally demand flexibility may not meet the metric. But let me stop, and Christine.
Thanks. I've been following the conversation. It kind of sounds like we might need a little bullet or triangle there that the emissions would be verified in some way. And I forgot the second half of what I was going to say. I'll jump back in as soon as I remember it.
Please do.
Oh yes, that we would need a specific bullet that that the AQCC make sure it's not double counted by utility programs. Thanks.
Yep. And I think we were working to put that in. Well, there it goes. It's in now. We're going to get that.
And I wanted to just take a moment to quickly address, Katrina, your thought on making sure that this piece is in addition to this piece. And I wonder if we simply change the intro language for the second paragraph to say something along the lines of, in addition to participation in a demand response program, the task force recommends, or, just adding the language to say this plus this. Okay. And then the final piece that I'm not sure we've addressed, but that I've heard a couple of times is the behind the meter consideration, and if we need to be specific within this proposal to say we encourage the AQCC to look at both utility programs as well as behind the meter load shedding to support this partial credit. And I think I've heard that from a couple of folks, but wasn't sure if that was something we wanted to include in the language here.
And Kim, I think that we probably do at least want to change that sentence after the bold partial site UI credit, where it says for participation in add utility demand response program, after program, or has, or let's see, this is really hard to do live. This is why partial set, or what provides it for participants, or has a behind the meter system which reduces energy use. And there needs to be something about verifying the actual energy reduction. I'm not sure if that goes there or in the bullet points below. Well, we need to clean that up, and we can do that during a break, because right now it doesn't read well.
Or has a behind the meter peak demand device. I don't know what those are called. I'm going to look to Jim for some guidance on what we call that piece.
Or just technology.
Technology.
Yeah. And I guess down below we have something already on the emission, on the energy reduction, so that's fine.
Yeah, that reads pretty well to me.
Do we need to have in that first sentence anything about GHG reduction? We have it reduces energy use, site UI, but do we need to put something about GHG in there?
I'll respond from where we are. We have been we've focused this largely on the site EUI metric because we'd heard a lot of concern about the ability of building owners to do greenhouse gas accounting on the building side. And so trying to be responsive to that, have stuck with that site EUI. I think if we add that language, I'm not sure how. I think perhaps that may go below in terms of, you know, things that the division could think about as it implements the recommendation. But it seems hard to put it into the recommendation alongside the site EUI credit and energy reduction. So perhaps under the, you know, avoiding double counting, that it should result in emissions reductions. But Christine, you may have a better response than I do. In fact, you probably do.
No, I just wanted to comment that in that first bit, I was reading that the demand response wouldn't necessarily reduce the site EUI, but we would give them credit as if it did, right? So it's like an equivalent.
Yep. So Karen, would you be okay if we added that language down below, not in the initial recommendation, but in the bullet points? So perhaps under
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear on what it reduces, or, you know, I just wanted to be really clear in that first sentence about what it reduces and why we're including this as a alternative.
And I apologize again, there seems to be a bunch of stuff happening in the chat that I can't track. So if there are conversations that we need to be having, if the Lotus team can flag those, that would be helpful. Otherwise, I will apologize to everyone who's dropping things in the chat. Yeah, so if we can add another bullet under the, I don't know, whatever color that is, orange bullet. And we probably need an introduction to the bulleted list that says something like, in developing rules to implement this recommendation, the task force I'm going to have to use recommends again, but recommends, and we can work on a different word. The division consider the following.
And Keith, I just want to be mindful of our time here since we have a lot on our agendas today, and I know this conversation is a very big conversation.
I appreciate it, Crystal. We'll get through it all. I mean, if we need to work through this, we'll work through this, and we'll take the time that we need to for folks. So, I guess one alternative, we can come up with this on a break and come back to this at the end, if you'd rather do it that way. So Kim, let's move on. You and I can work on this offline, and we can discuss the civil penalty recommendation with folks. And before we close out the meeting, we'll come back up to this slide. Does that work?
Before we do, Nori had a question or comment.
Oh, I lowered my hand, but I think that whatever was bullet number 3, I just didn't want to lose sight of the point of demand response, which was encapsulated in that bullet number 3 that just disappeared. So, and we're getting sort of prescriptive with some of this language when it's supposed to be a broad proposal, and some of the feedback and the comments was how prescriptive some of the recommendations were. But the point is, we want people to be compliant, and we wanted to incentivize the demand flexibility as an option. That's all.
I actually think thank you for that comment, Nori. And I think that's a really good transition to a vote. Like we've done with previous proposals, as we're writing these recommendations, like there could be some more wordsmithing of these proposals, but putting it up to a vote now of a general consensus, if the task force wants to wants to include this broad proposal in the recommendations or not. And so I'm going to launch that poll now.
Crystal, I'm sorry. I thought just clarify, I thought we were going to wordsmith this offline and bring it back to a vote at the end of the meeting. Did I misunderstand that?
I don't think we have time to wordsmith it online during this meeting. It would have to be after this meeting.
Well, maybe a friendly amendment. I think there was some concern around the additional guy. I agree. First of all, thank you, Nori, for the vote really, in my view, is on those first two paragraphs. The bullet points below are some additional guidance that I think would be how the task force would like the division and the Air Commission to think about implementing that general recommendation. But that wouldn't in and of itself be part of the recommendation. So we're happy to capture those additional bullet points, but the recommendation really is that first and second paragraph. Jim?
Yeah, I think we should vote now because we're all going to have a chance to wordsmith this more over the next 6 weeks.
Okay. Happy to let Crystal launch the poll.
And I'm tallying 15 people. So I'm waiting for a few more people.
Do we know if Paul voted before he left the meeting or?
Yeah,
Paul
I think we're at 14 people now, actually, Crystal.
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Kara dropped off and she did include a vote for this proposal before she left.
Okay. Well, we have majority. So the proposal will be included in the recommendations and we will still work on the wordsmithing with the task force.
Thank you, everyone, for working through that with us, for all the feedback, and we'll continue, as Crystal said, to work on that language. If I'm going to beg forgiveness and ask a favor of the task force, could I go off camera and off mic for 2 minutes because something behind me smells like it's burning and I have a feeling one of my children left a pan on the stove. So I will be right back.
As Keith deals with hopefully not a fire issue, we can move forward on civil penalties. And so the last meeting, we did have a very fruitful discussion on civil penalties, and you can go to the next slide, Kim. And so this is a repeat slide again from the last meeting and just to refresh the task force, but kind of building off of our last conversation on demand flexibility, this proposal will need to be kept very broad. The more detailed rules about the penalties will be up to the Air Division to decide. And as just a reminder, the statute does reference that the types of civil penalties, that the first penalty shall not exceed $2,000 and the subsequent penalty or violation shall not exceed $5,000. And that's all the guidance that the statute provides. The Department of Health and Human Environment, CDPHE is how we refer to them. They are the body that investigates the penalties. And so CEO is the implementer and the program implementer. We work with the building owners, but once that compliance deadline hits, we pass it over to CDPHE of here are the building owners that we have notified. They're in compliance or they're not in compliance. So that's kind of a little bit of the background of how it works with the penalties and between the agencies. And some things that the benchmarking requirements and penalties are listed in our statute, but again, those are separate from the BPS. So the civil penalty for the benchmarking would stack on top of a BPS penalty as well. And unless a building owner was granted a waiver, time extension, or an adjusted compliance option, which we've talked about in the previous meetings, a target or timeline adjustment, unless they have applied and have been granted either of those, they will have to abide by the BPS requirements. And so that is, and another item to remember is that any building owner who is in repeated noncompliance would have a different fine or penalty for each offense. So that is how CEO is interpreting the statute. And then moving on to the next slide, I know that's a lot of information. And we can go through the proposal line by line. But again, kind of similar to the demand flexibility proposal, this civil penalty proposal is very broad. The Energy Office has considered your feedback on the cost of making sure the penalties are higher than the cost of compliance, and then also looking into what DC and Denver did as well. And all of those are great ideas, but that will be up to the Air Division and especially CDPHE, who already sets penalties for other programs. And so what we have done is make this proposal very broad, but try to incorporate some of the task force's feedback. So I'm going to read this out line by line. I'll actually try to separate it on the slide as well. But essentially the proposal that we've come up with is that the task force recommends that the AQCC adopt rules regarding civil penalties for building owners who fail to submit a BPS report, as well as civil penalties in regard to building owners failing to meet their site UI target. To help individual buildings meet their site UI targets and for the covered building sector as a whole to meet the GHG emission targets, the task force recommends the AQCC adopt a civil penalty structure that sets penalties above the cost of compliance. And with the bullets, some things that we wanted to call out was that there would be separate penalties for each requirement. So setting out that submitting BPS documentation, that is a separate requirement than meeting your site EUI. So that therefore there'd be penalties associated with each. And I think I actually may have duplicated that on the slide. So I apologize for that. But that is the general proposal. Again, it's very broad and we understand that that is hard to deal with on the task force's side. But are there any questions, concerns? We wanted to leave some time for discussion. If there's a different bullet you'd like to include underneath, this would be the time to discuss that.
And Kathy, yeah, why don't you start us off?
Thank you. And I apologize. I got a gazillion things going on in the background and I didn't want to be a distraction. How are they going to determine cost of compliance? Because won't that vary depending on what your EUI is and how close you are to it and what you have to do? So I don't understand how they're going to determine cost of compliance.
That is something that we heard from the task force, and that's what we want to include in the proposal, but that will be up to the AQCC to decide. We can add some wording into here on assessing the cost of compliance by the square footage of the building or something like that.
And thanks, Kathy. Stacy, I'll pass it to you and then to Bill.
Thanks. I have one question, and that is if there are municipal ordinances in place that also have penalties or potential for penalties for non-compliance with reporting, which comes first? And do we need to note that buildings may be subject to penalties from their local ordinance in addition to penalties from the state? Or I don't know.
That's a good question and consideration, Stacy. That's actually something that's referenced in our statute, that our benchmarking and BPS requirements do not, I think the word was supersede any other local jurisdiction's requirements. So they can have their own requirements and civil penalties. So ideally, if there is a jurisdiction with their own penalties and a building owner is in non-compliance with that jurisdiction in the state, they would have multiple penalties then.
Bill, up to you.
Sure. So the legislation is pretty firm on limiting penalties to $2,000 for the first violation, $5 for the second. How do you use that to get penalties above cost of compliance? I know we struggled last meeting with, well, we're going to do it on a daily basis or a monthly basis or something. But how does that work?
I think, sorry, Crystal, go ahead.
You can go ahead, Keith.
I was just going to say to Kathy's point around the challenge of determining the cost of compliance, I think the recommendation is that that be left to the rulemaking process to work out those details, because there will be a need to determine cost of compliance. And so the actual sort of structure of a first versus second versus nth violation may result, may come out of that calculation. There would be a lot of ways to do it in terms of setting the penalties above the cost of compliance. And so again, we're making a broad recommendation around what the Air Commission should do, not how they should do it, because there's more than one way to get at that result.
Because in earlier meetings, we asked that question and the answer, I think, was nope, all we can find people is $5,000. It can't be higher than that.
So
now maybe
to clarify, that's per next violation. I think that it's an open question how you calculate next violation.
Right. Okay.
Yes, in the rulemaking process, that is something that can be developed and scheduled out, and it's going to be a very complicated calculation to figure out as well. And so that's why, again, to get consensus at the task force level and to provide a recommendation around this is why we're keeping it broad and trying to incorporate some of your concerns there.
So maybe we'll pass it to Cecil next, and then Christine.
I just wanted to say, I mean, I personally don't agree with having a penalty above the cost of compliance. I think, once you start making the penalties more than what the fix is, it turns into getting the cheapest way possible then to comply, which may not be the best long-term solution. So, you kind of want, in my opinion, to convince building owners to, make a long-term commitment and not use the lowest bidder that is going to come in and maybe get them there and maybe not. But I just don't think making the penalties above cost of compliance is an effective way to accomplish the goals.
Yeah, thanks, Cecil. Appreciate that perspective. And Christine, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks. My comment is that the more detail we could give to the AQCC, the better. I think we have a lot of collective knowledge and opinions amongst us, and I get reluctant to just say, in general, just let the AQCC figure it out, because we may be better equipped to figure it out ourselves, or at least to include some options. So I guess that's the gist of my thoughts, is that we could put some bullet points that say options could include, or options discussed by the task force include, or something like that, rather than just go figure it out.
And I think that that's something as we go forward over the next several weeks, if we're talking about sort of that bullet point list at the bottom that really is additional guidance beyond the recommendation, we could work through that in a review of the document that will be submitted to Will and to the AQCC. I think for the purposes of today, we're really talking about Christine voting on those first two paragraphs, but happy to continue to work on that additional guidance or set of considerations.
And I guess building off of that, and before we go to a vote, I know it's a little bit duplicated on the slide, but is everyone on the task force okay with the language that we provided around that there be separate BPS requirements of you have to submit documentation or a BPS report? That's one requirement, and that is separate from meeting the site UI requirement. So that's one way that we try to structure that. Are people okay with that, or is there disagreement there? Go ahead, Stacy. Oh, sorry, you did thumbs up. And I also, I guess, to provide some background, and I apologize if it's already clear, but we know that this is a very broad proposal, but that's something that we wanted to try to build in of there's separate requirements. You can submit a report, but that doesn't necessarily mean you met your site UI target. And so therefore, if you have those two separate requirements, there are penalties for not meeting either of those. So that those are the two big things that we built into this proposal. And so if there's any comments or concerns with those two, feel free to speak up now before we take this to, again, a very broad vote.
I feel like we need another couple bullets before a broad vote. And I'm still thinking on the fly what those could be. One could be task force recommends that the AQCC consider daily or monthly accumulating fines or something like that, so they know what we're getting at. I'm guessing daily would be too strict, so I'm not recommending that. I'm just thinking on the fly. In other words, not just a 5,000 and you're done. And we could discuss if there's additional things about civil penalties that might be warranted. For instance, should penalties be lowered for buildings that submit a plan for how they're going to meet their targets or something like that?
We can actually, on your last point, we can add in a bullet that's specific of if a building owner has been approved for an adjusted target or timeline, because in those proposals, it was specified they have to submit documentation showing how they will meet their target or their adjusted target. And so maybe we add a bullet connecting the two of if you have been approved for adjusted compliance timeline or target, and connect that to the penalties. Is that kind of where you're going, Christine, or no?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. That's fine. And then I'll have another point after Nori.
Sorry, I also, I wasn't here last time, so I'm sorry to be weighing in late, but I also don't agree that the cost of compliance, that the penalty should be more than the cost of compliance. And an example of that is we're in the affordable housing business. It's the local public health agency that regulates contamination. When we have methamphetamine contamination in one of our affordable housing properties, the maximum penalty that they're going to give us as the owner to clean up a contaminated building is $10,000. And so that seems worse than worse of a public health issue, air quality issue than not complying with the BPS targets. And that's just my opinion. But to go into 50,000, hundreds of thousands, I mean, that's what the cost of compliance could be for some of these buildings. And I'm concerned about setting the penalty above the cost of compliance. Totally agree that we want to have those two, you submit the BPS and you meet your site EUI targets, or you get two separate penalties, but the cost and scale seems out of whack.
Yeah, thanks, Nori. And if Nori or Cecil, if you all have any recommendations on potential adjustments to that language, feel free to think about those and let us know. But Christine, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks. I don't know how to reconcile this for affordable housing in particular, which seems like a unique case, but I think the reasoning behind setting the penalty above the cost of compliance is that we don't want all buildings just paying their way out. You just pay a nominal fee and then you're done and we get no emissions reductions. That would be a worst case scenario here. We'd get some money out of it and hopefully we'd put the money to good use, but we wouldn't get the results that we want to see. So I think that was the reason behind that structure. But if there's better ways to frame it, or for unique situations like affordable housing, maybe we could think through that. My other thought, I was hoping we could talk through when's the latest someone could submit a request for a waiver or an adjustment, because I think the day before your report's due is too late to apply. Is it 6 months or 3 months or something like that?
So Christine, I'll jump in on that last point, and it may be with respect to affordable housing. You know, there's another bullet point under the additional considerations that asks the commission to consider, you know, some adjustment to the civil penalty for affordable housing or something like that, and to leave it there. So that's one approach we can take. With respect to when you can apply, I thought a lot about that over the intervening couple of weeks. And again, it's something I really want to leave to the rulemaking, but something that occurred to me is you could be right on the edge of submitting the report and you have a failure of a major piece of your HVAC unit. And all of a sudden now, you're going to have to do a new thing and you're probably going to need a waiver at the last minute. We have to consider those kinds of, as somebody who's both hot water heater and furnace went out on a Friday afternoon, those things happen at unexpected moments, right? Like you try and plan for them, but you don't always get there. And so I don't want us to get bogged down in that level of detail here. I think I'd encourage the adoption of the broad recommendation, knowing that, yeah, we'll absolutely need to think about, like, does there need to be some sort of cutoff except for exigent circumstances, because we have to account for that too. Again, that's why we have tried to defer a lot of this detailed consideration to the rulemaking process, and is because we probably, as a task force, we don't have the time to go through all of the different considerations that may need to be adopted into regulatory or rule language. So
do you think you could put that as a bullet point? For instance, the task force recommends that the UCC set a cutoff.
We can list, sorry, Christine, we can list any
unique
number of bullet points we want, but again, we're trying to get adoption of that broad recommendation and trying to be less prescriptive than more prescriptive. Because I think
right. I'm leaning the other way of putting more detail in here, given that a lot of, for instance, advocates don't have unlimited resources to participate in a long, extensive rulemaking process. In addition to the task force, so the more detail we could put in here, I think the better.
Again, the recommendations will be the recommendations, and that's that first set of 2 paragraphs. But I don't want to keep talking because I know we've got Karen and Kathy and Katrina.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I don't agree that we shouldn't have, that we should have a cutoff. I'll just say, a lot of these building owners should know better, and that's fine. But the last day is the last day. And if you submit your report, you submit your report. If people abuse it, then they're probably going to get fined for something else anyway. But anyway, it's just a thought. Thank you.
Hi, and I would go sort of back to, I think it was Bill who said it, and then Joel put it in the chat. And I'm not understanding how it is that that the AQCC is going to be able to set fines other than what was very specifically stated in the legislation.
So I appreciate that, and I certainly don't want to get into a legal discussion with respect to the interpretation of the statute, but I think that there is the possibility going forward that the Air Commission could interpret a violation as occurring on any number of different schedules. I think, as maybe it was Christine said, you could do it on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, an annual basis. The statute, I don't think, speaks to how to determine when a violation has occurred. Just that for a first violation, there's one penalty, and for a subsequent violation, there's an additional one. Katrina?
Thanks. Just 2 thoughts. I wonder if where it says the penalty should be above the cost of compliance, if we might want to be a bit more specific there, so that they're not too much above the cost of compliance. I believe our task force said somewhat above the cost of compliance. And even that, when we had to interpret it, was a little bit vague. So we settled on somewhat above the cost of compliance for 85% of the buildings. I don't know if that's the right threshold, but that is the sort of decision that EQCC will have to make. Our targets were set so that all buildings had to be as good as the top 15%. So that's where the 85% was consistent with. So those might be possible additions. And then I was also wondering if we shouldn't be prescriptive in that third bullet down below around monthly, but just be a little more general, because and maybe to get it, I think where you were going, Kathy, where that should align with the size of the building. I think what's most important is that penalties should align with the amount of energy that the building has not saved, because you could be a very large building and be very close to your target, and you shouldn't be penalized as much as a large building that's very far from its target. And so something around aligning with the amount of energy that a building has not saved seems key. We did a study recently of the cost of compliance for 50 different buildings, and it ranges from $15,000 to $55 million, right? Like this, we're talking a really big range, depending on if it's a small building that doesn't have to do much, or if it's an enormous building that has to do an awful lot. And so sometimes for a very large building to actually get a yes on good energy projects that they should do from their management, they may need a penalty that is quite sizable, and that might have to be more like the daily, with the structure, daily violation, given the structure of these penalties. So I would just, yeah, some interval. I like that. And energy savings, perfect. I'll look at the language now.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina, for suggesting those changes. And Cecil and I think it was Nori, but definitely let us know if that seems to capture a little bit of what you guys were getting at with your thoughts. Cecil, see your hands up.
Yeah, I mean, I just think anytime you're, like I said, it's cost of compliance is a lot. And if you want to, I just don't think it's an effective way to get there. You don't want to make the fines so big that the cheapest route is what they're going to do. And I don't think that's a good long-term solution. Thank you.
Thanks, Cecil. Bill, I'll pass it to you.
Oops, there we go. I mean, I know what we're trying to accomplish here. My concern is we're trying to save greenhouse gas emissions. And if we have one building that's, say, 2 kBTU off of goal, and another building that's 200 kBTU off of goal, we are better off helping the 200 kBTU guy meet his goal. And he saved, say, a half. He saves 100 kBTU versus the guy that saves 1 kBTU, So I kind of feel like, and maybe AQCC will do this, but some of these buildings just can't meet goal. They will not meet goal. And we're better off helping those that can save a ton of energy to reduce greenhouse gas than we are to penalize the guys that are close.
So kind of building off Bill's comment, and I'll refer to you here, Keith, but I think we need to again throw this to a broad vote, and we have these additional considerations. But with what Bill just said, this highlighted yellow part, I think that can actually be included with the accumulating fines at some interval of whether that's monthly, daily, or whatnot, and then also assessing those fines based on how close or far they are away from their target. So I think that could go with that bullet, and we can put that up to a vote to include that in, and then vote on the broad proposal. Keith, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have, a general recommendation and some additional considerations. Sorry, Bill, did you want to jump in again, or is your hand still up? Okay, sorry. I do the same thing, so I just wanted to make sure I wasn't talking over someone, that's all. I think moving to a vote makes sense, recognizing that, there are additional considerations that some task force members have spoken to, but I don't know that we've heard a lot of agreement on all of those things. And I think we've been trying to capture in different recommendations that additional language.
And Katrina actually put some language in the chat that I actually thank you, Katrina, for that. I think this reads a little weird, so I'm actually going to paste Katrina's cost. So adopting a civil penalty structure that sets penalties somewhat above the cost of compliance and in proportion to a required EUI reduction not achieved. And then with that said, Keith, I think I'll bring up that broad, the vote for the broad proposal.
Great, thank you.
And Lotus, please let me know if we're still waiting on 14 people to vote or more.
I'm counting 13 now.
13. Okay. Okay, I will end the poll. If someone is trying to vote and can't, please notify us and just put your vote in the chat to me or send me an email. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm not showing the results. So 69% voted to include the broad proposal. And with that, we can move on to the next proposal, Keith, of Beyond 2030.
And Keith, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Given time, I think I'll sort of skip the intro slide, except to say that, you know, statute has some requirements around post 2030. And so we have a proposed recommendation for the task force with respect to the direction to the AQCC on post 2030, and that is to reconvene a task force no later than June 1, 2028, to begin looking at the next iteration of a BPS post 2030. And the proposed language is on the slide. So I'll stop, let folks read that and see if there's any discussion or questions. Seeing no questions, Crystal, I'm not sure if you want to bring up the vote.
Yeah, I can bring up the vote. I wanted to provide everyone a little bit more background, and I'm sorry that the slide is a little bit harder to read. But as Keith mentioned, we have the BPS requirements for 2026 and 2030. And so what the Energy Office introduced in the proposal was to have a task force reconvened, not necessarily you guys, but another task force by June 1st of 2028 to provide a year of hopefully some data analysis on how the BPS requirements were met or not met, and things like that, and then have that task force either reassess past 2030 if the metrics should stay the same, and just or reevaluate property targets. And so that's what this proposal is trying to break out. And so again, very broad, and it's so far away that it kind of needs to stay broad until the state knows more about our building performance standards in general. So with that, I'm going to leave it for a few questions or discussion here and then bring up that vote. Are there any big concerns or questions around this? Or can we not imagine past 2030 right now?
The first line of the second paragraph, the AQCC should also recommend that a technical consultant assist the task force, because we're not asking the AQCC to recommend the specific consultant that they want us to use.
Right. Good catch.
And in general, I don't have a better way to do it. I mean, it's unfortunate that we won't have the 2030 data, but hopefully we'll at least know if we're on the right track just based on what happened in 2026. So I don't know a better way to do it.
I'm looking at the statute now, and for the 2030 process, it doesn't necessarily say that's June 1st of 2028, or sorry, 2028. But in order to assess the BPS after 2030, that would mean that a task force would convene in 2031 or 2032, therefore not allowing a BPS to kick in. So if there's any thoughts on this 2028, do we want to make it 2029 and assess the data they have at that point? Any thoughts there?
And while folks are thinking, Cecil, I'll pass it to you, and then Karen, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
My only question, I guess, is, where 2022, we're working on stuff that has to be met by 2030. Same 20-year span to try to make recommendations for seems like a long time. Is that something that's in the statute, or can you shorten that time frame to say 2030 to 2040?
That is in statute, 2030 to 2050.
Thank you.
It's a good question.
Yeah, thanks, Cecil. Karen.
Yeah, I think this is really, really a lot. I think this task force has been amazing in coming up with recommendations to AQCC, but I'm not sure that a task force has a role in advising. I think all building owners are going to have implemented this, and so building owners and their consultants, there needs to be an outreach. And so I think there needs to be a technical consultant that does the outreach that we need, and it's not limited to a task force. So I'm just not sure that this sort of thing, I think everybody should be engaged, and you don't need a task force for that. You need a PR firm and the CEO and, that kind of thing. But everybody should be engaged, all building owners, and see how it's working and how the reporting's going. So anyway, that was just my.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. That's a really important thought. I mean, just to that piece, would the task force be interested in adding language to recommend that a technical consultant to assist perhaps I would suggest maybe the CEO and task force and conduct outreach and analysis on the performance standard, something that just indicates that outreach should be conducted, and it should be a broader effort than just supporting the task force.
Yeah, I guess I'm just not thinking that the task force is soliciting public input. You guys are doing that on our behalf. So, that's not really what a task force does. They come up with new stuff, and this one is evaluating, right? Am I understanding that right? They're evaluating the success of the program.
Evaluating the success of the. Go ahead, Keith.
No, go ahead, Crystal.
I was going to say the purpose would be to evaluate the current BPS and success of it, and then how to continue the BPS to 2050. So that would be twofold.
Then I guess I think it should be reversed. They should get the data, make sure they have all the outreach done, and then put it in front of a task force.
Keith, go ahead.
No, I think we have a suggestion from Karen that makes a lot of sense. I was just going to observe that I think the recommendation here is in two directions. One is a technical recommendation that the Air Commission engage a consultant to do the data analysis, and there's a separate recommendation from the task force that the Air Commission convene or call for a new task force that would do work roughly similar to the work that it's done, including that we have, as a task force, taken public input. So I think that there are essentially two post-30 recommendations here. And what I hear Karen suggesting, I think makes sense, and I think somebody in the chat may have agreed to it, is that you almost flip those, and that is that the technical consultant is engaged first, does the work, and then the task force is stood up to come forward with recommendations.
And thank you
And Karen, I apologize if I misrepresented what you said, but I think that's what I heard.
Thank you for saying that, Karen, too. And I do see people agreeing with Karen on the chat, especially on having the data before convening. And that was something we tried to structure into this proposal, have some data to work off of first. And so we need obviously to make sure that that is clear in this proposal.
I was just going to mention that if this is wildly successful and we nailed it, you probably don't need the task force. So I guess the task force is if we really need some work on this program. So that's their value.
Bill.
Yeah, I do agree with Karen, but I also feel like the task force members should be folks that have been living with rules, and they will come with suggestions on how to improve them or what didn't work. I think we're going to be kind of surprised at how hard this may be and what the unintended consequences might be as we go forward. So I think the task force needs to have a significant component of folks that represent people living with these rules. Thanks.
Yeah, great thought. Thanks for sharing that, Bill.
There's no more comments, Kim, actually. So we did try to take some of your feedback and put that in the bullets on the bottom to help provide more details around this proposal. With that, again, voting more on the broad proposal, because we do need to react to the public's feedback. I'm going to put this to a vote. And so let me bring that up. Oh, I'm so sorry. I was still sharing that. I did not mean to do that. And I will launch this poll now.
Great. And Crystal, we're at similar to last time, 13.
Okay, perfect.
And Nori stepped away, but she put in the chat that she is a yes for this one.
Okay. So we were just waiting on one or two people. Oh, here we go. And so unanimous to include this. And so this will be included in the recommendations, apologies. And we will continue to work on some of that wordsmithing with the task force. I'll pass it back to the Lotus team.
Okay, fantastic. So thank you all for that wonderful just deliberation on those final proposals. We are very grateful for your time to spend getting through those today. So before we dive into the public survey results, we want to give everyone just like a really quick 5-minute brain refresh. Everyone use the restroom, grab a snack, grab a drink, and we will reconvene at 2:40 to dive into the results. Okay, everybody, if you can hear my voice, please make your way back to your computers so we can get going with the second half of our meeting today. So I'll wait till I see faces on the screen and then we'll know folks are back. When I see most faces, we will dive back in. Okay. And Julia, just want to check that you're there. Here we are. And I see you're still eating your snack. Okay, everyone. Well, thanks again, as I said, for the fantastic first half of this meeting. During the second half of our meeting today, we are going to provide you a really high-level summary of the public feedback we got during through our survey and during our public meetings. And then we'll open up the floor and ask that you guys, if you all have any reactions or ideas for reactions to the public input that we received and ideas on how we might update the specific recommendations that we've already voted on. And so I hope you all have had a chance to review the pre-work that we sent out. I know that it was lengthy and like 95 pages of write-in public comment, but that was really where all of the great feedback our team thought was really housed in those comments. So we didn't want to hide any of that insight from you guys. So like I said, I hope you all had a chance to review it and flag some things you want to discuss. We'll cover the high level and then we'll open up the floor from there. So Julia, I will pass it off to you to take us through.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kim. So as Kim mentioned, we did send that detailed document of public comments. And if you did have a chance to read through them, then in a few slides here, then we'll open it up, and I'd really love to hear from you on what are the key comments that you think we need to address in terms of any edits to our recommendations before we put them into the final report. But before we dive into that, just a little bit of an overview in terms of the public meeting, the demographics for folks that attended those and who we received feedback from and input from. We had 78 total meeting registrants. As you can see, a lot of them, the majority of them came from the Front Range area, so Denver, Boulder, Jefferson, and Adams County. The other sector that you're seeing on the right-hand side of the screen, so we had quite a few good representation from energy and facility managers, utilities. That other sector includes folks who are doing benchmarking or energy benchmarking service professionals, performance analysts, construction professionals, energy consultants, some federal government representatives, higher ed, hospitality, lobbyists, and the like. So those were kind of all grouped together in that other category. And then in terms of the survey itself, if you want to move us forward on a slide. Thanks, Kim. So we had 125 total survey respondents. Again, a lot of those responses were coming from the Front Range area. Denver, Jefferson, Arapahoe, Boulder, and Douglas County were the most commonly responded from counties. Workforce represented the largest sector of responses that we received at almost 2/3 of the responses that we received came from the workforce sector, as well as building owners and local government making up another portion of that sector as well. Same with the public meetings, the demographics in terms of racial representation and ethnic representation in our input that we received was definitely leaned towards white, but there we did get some input from folks who identify otherwise as well. So on to the summary of public feedback. In terms of the BPS metric, overwhelmingly, we did see respondents somewhat or fully supporting the recommendation to use site UI as the BPS metric. I think that this is one that we can certainly talk about a little bit more, but the good to know that there was broad response in support of BPS metric being site UI. For crediting renewable energy generation, we did still receive majority of respondents somewhat or fully representing, supporting this recommendation, but a quarter of respondents did somewhat or fully oppose this recommendation. So we will dive into that a little bit more and discuss if there's anything that we need to dive into and revise in terms of our renewable energy generation recommendation. And then in terms of electrification, again, almost a quarter of respondents somewhat or fully opposed this recommendation, but the vast majority did fully or somewhat support the recommendation for electrification. And then compliance adjustment, this is the one that we saw the greatest level of support on. So 76% over three quarters, excuse me, of respondents did support our compliance adjustment recommendations either somewhat or fully, with just 14% opposing those. And then on to kind of diving into our final recommendations, we really want to make sure that that as we're finalizing the recommendations for the BPS that we're considering as public input. So again, Kim mentioned that like 80-page document of the survey responses, and we did organize those by the recommendation. So hopefully you did have time to dive in. I know that I did, and in reading through, I noticed that, there were some comments that were, folks that maybe were just opposed to the BPS on its face, and it's important for us to understand that that is a group that that is represented throughout the state. But it is in state statute that we're going to be moving forward with this. So those comments aside, there were also some comments that I do think are worth us looking at and considering in terms of if there's any revisions that we want to make to our final recommendations of the BPS. So with that, as we embark on these next few slides, I would really just welcome you all to raise your hands or jump in the chat, or in the conversation, and share with us, which of those comments you think are really worth diving into and really worth us considering in terms of any revisions to our recommendations. So Kim, if you want to move us forward. Great. All right. So again, on that BPS metric, we had, again, 71% of respondents supporting this recommendation, but almost a quarter of folks did oppose the recommendation. You can see that from those that are opposing the recommendation, the opposition came largely from workforce, but also the support largely came from workforce as well. Again, that was 66% of our survey respondents identified as being from the workforce sector. So not surprising there. But I am curious, and I'm just going to take a moment to pause and see if anyone who had a chance to dive into the specific comments that we received on the survey wanted to make any suggestions on revisions to the BPS metric and target setting.
Yeah, Kathy.
Yeah, I did read through a lot of it, and it seemed like sort of the most heartburn that I was seeing regarding the site EUI had to do with how can we determine flexibility within building types. So let's say a building type is a commercial downtown office building. But depending on occupancy and who your tenants are, your actual EUI might be very different. So, their concerns seem to be, will it not only be weather adjusted, but will it be age adjusted for the age of buildings and those types of things. So their concern wasn't necessarily about EUI, but how it will be identified for specific buildings within specific building types.
Yeah, Absolutely. That, I think that's what I saw as well. There were some comments around ensuring that we account for the different, also in multi-use buildings, that we're accounting for the different types that are in with that one building structure. So that's something as well. Thank you, Kathy, for bringing that up. Did you have any thoughts on, maybe Kim, if you could move us forward to the next slide that has our recommendation on it. So this is our recommendation as it stands. And I'm curious if there's any thoughts on how this should be revised. And Stacy, I'll throw it over to you.
Yes, Stacy. Yep.
Sorry. Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, this is what Kathy just described and outlined is kind of what I was thinking about, maybe a lot of folks' unfamiliarity with Energy Star Portfolio Manager, right? Because Portfolio Manager is already taking into account the age of the building, your location of your building, the size, occupancy. I mean, if you include all that data, right? And so, while I agree that those are relevant concerns, I guess I feel like maybe they're going to actually be addressed. Folks just might not know if or how they would be addressed. Now, there is a challenge for building types that do not have an Energy Star score necessarily, but anyway, I guess I just wanted to bring up this Energy Star thing again because we don't talk about it, and yet it's the foundation of how all of the reporting and in a sense compliance is going to happen.
Stacy, if I could just respond to that, I totally agree that when you're getting your information from the Energy Star program, that's going to give you the good EUI information for your building. I think what I'm hearing from our folks and is not about what is their EUI, but how are the targets going to be set? And will the targets take that into account? And that's their biggest concern, I think.
And I can echo this too, is that during the public meetings, this is something that CEO heard as well. And we tried to address at least some of those concerns since the targets have not been set. And that is not something the task force is doing. That is something that will be happening during rulemaking. So CEO has heard these concerns loud and clear going into setting these targets. And I just do see on the recommendation from the task force that it was recommended that they be weather normalized targets. We can add something to the task force language recommending that these targets be more equitable or flexible, or if the task force wanted to do that based on the feedback we've heard. But I do agree with Kathleen that there's concerns of how the targets are set, but the public and building owners will at least have that methodology once those targets are set. The state will be very clear about that.
Thanks, Crystal. Is there anyone who wants to propose any alternative language or any additional language that we want to add regarding the weather, any normalization in addition to weather normalization? Yeah, Kathy.
You know, you could just, I don't have exact words, but so maybe don't type exactly what I'm saying, but maybe something after a weather normalized target, also taking under consideration building age, occupancy, tenant type.
Julia, create a new bullet for that. Not that it doesn't necessarily go there, but let's just create a new bullet that these targets should also consider building age, building type. Go ahead, Kathy, sorry.
Yeah, so age, building type, so the your occupancy level, your tenant type, you know, because we all know that varying different tenant types utilize different types of energy use, and that should be taken into consideration. Because what we don't want to encourage is building owners saying, oh, well, I can't rent to you because you use too much energy. And so, yeah. And I'm open to other things if people have other ideas about what should be included in that. That was just off my head.
Great, thanks, Kathy. Any other thoughts, suggestions from the task force? Thanks, Joel, in the chat.
One, I guess the last one that I didn't mention would be mixed use. Now that might be in the building type and tenant type, but that was specifically called out a number of times.
Great, great, thanks, Kathy. Jim.
Yeah, that comment just a bit ago about not wanting to rent to somebody.
Oh, you're muted.
That uses a lot of energy. That's interesting to me. It made me just think maybe there's a way to encourage tenants to use less energy. Not that, you know, some people just can't with what they do, but I think we want to somehow motivate tenants to use less energy, because sometimes that's a problem between landlords and tenants.
Great, good, thanks, Jim. Well, we want to make sure that we cover all of the other components of our recommendations as well. So if there is nothing else on metric and target setting, we'll move on to the renewables recommendation. All right, so again, we had 64% of folks responding that they supported the recommendation for crediting renewable energy generation as it is written by the task force, but a quarter of folks definitely expressing some opposition to this. Kim, if you could move us forward to the next slide, that I think we have our actual renewable recommendations on. Oops, that is not. Oh, yep, there it is. Okay, great.
Julia, just so you know, you're breaking
so,
in again, and it seems like you're delayed. Just want to make sure you have good internet connection right now.
Let's see. Why don't I, Kim, if you want to take this over so that folks aren't struggling to understand me, that would be great.
Happy to. Thanks, Julia. Okay, so yeah, looking at this, the language you see on the slide, this is for the language as it stands for renewable energy crediting recommendation. And so based on any public feedback, would love to open the floor to see if there are any suggested revisions or changes to this proposal. And Nori, I'll pass it to you to start us off.
Thank you. So a couple of the comments that I don't know how to fix with the language, but that surprised me were one, that that our policy language eliminated the ability for affordable housing owners to take advantage of a program like solar rewards because of the way that we have structured the recs. And then the second one that took me by surprise was that this, the alternative compliance, well, now I can't remember exactly what it was, but that what we had stated was conflicting with what City of Boulder had put in place. And I thought that we had kind of matched up with Boulder and Denver. So those were the two public comments that I wanted to check in about.
Yeah, thanks, Nori. And I am just pulling up quickly that Boulder comment so folks, we can share it. We just do a little find and search, but if anyone else has any thoughts to share while I'm doing this, please do so. So I believe the concern from the City of Boulder was that their policy, I believe, focuses on renewable energy generation, irrespective if the building owner owns the RECs. And so I think that was the rub with their policy as well, is that they're focused on supporting on-site renewable generation, and it doesn't matter who in their case owns the RECs. And if I got that wrong, feel free to jump in and correct me, anyone.
Did anyone else have any concerns or thoughts about the comments around renewables? Well, we do have renewable. Let's talk about renewables and then we'll go into electrification. But if there's no more comments, or we can move on to electrification.
Okay. I'm not hearing any, but I also don't want to cut off anyone's thought process. So we'll just give it 15 more seconds and we'll move on. Okay.
I'll add to Kim, and
Sure.
sorry, hopefully I'm not breaking up still, but I'll add to Kim's comments on Boulder's comments, which are that, you know, they really suggested that by requiring retirement of the REC, then that limits the incentive for on-site generation through utility programs. And I know we have had this discussion that is mainly applicable to Excel service territory, but that is, I think, the main comment that came from City of Boulder.
Thanks, Julia. So I'm not hearing any suggested changes or comments on how we might revise this recommendation as it stands. And so we will continue on to electrification. So looking at, again, the quick summary of folks who did or did not support the electrification recommendation, we had about 70% of folks supporting and about a quarter that did not support the electrification recommendation. And so we have our language for beneficial electrification here, and I'm also it's in 2 locations, and so I'm gonna maybe depending on which section we want to talk about, we have beneficial electrification included as a core compliance option. As we all know, the beneficial electrification, 80% of space and water heating loads with high efficiency electric equipment. So let's start with this one. Were there any thoughts or comments or concerns that you all read in the public feedback that you think would warrant an adjustment to this recommendation? And I'm not hearing any, which is, if this looks good as it stands, then that's fantastic. It means we did a good job, I guess, coming to consensus with this group. So we'll move then to the secondary piece of electrification, encouraging building owners to replace fossil fuel space and domestic hot water heating equipment with efficient electric technologies, providing partial credit for partial electrification. And are there any thoughts or ideas from the public comments that we want to bring up and discuss on this piece?
Just a thought, Kimberly, since we have space heating and water heating in the core compliance pathway, maybe the alternative compliance pathway is a little bit broader than just space heating and water heating. There are other opportunities for electrification that may fit within this particular area.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. That's a great thought. So that would be revising this piece to say, maybe fossil fuel equipment, maybe just potentially removing this piece from the broader recommendation for alternative compliance. Are there any thoughts from the rest of the task force? Do we like that proposed change? You can take head nods or thumbs up or notes in the chat. Seeing a couple light head nods. Okay. Well, let me just strike that text. So the new proposal would read, encourage building owners to replace fossil fuel equipment with efficient electric technology, provide partial credit for partial electrification.
And to clarify, this is not for the main compliance electrification. This is for the alternative compliance of partial electrification, correct?
That is how I understood Joel's comment, but Joel, correct me if that's, yeah.
Is this something we want to take a vote on to ensure that everyone agrees with this? Or do we want to do a simple thumbs up? Okay, so we're doing thumbs up in the camera. Lotus, are we able to do actually, no, if every, here, let me just do a quick Zoom poll. Or people can say that they agree or disagree in the chat to make it easy. I just want to make sure people are able to voice whether they agree or disagree on this, since it was something we previously voted on. So thank you. Okay, thank you guys for indulging me and putting it in the chat. And it seems like most people agree, so this is great.
Okay. Awesome. Great. Got lots of agrees in the chat. I think that was about 10 or so. Okay, so fantastic. If there aren't any other thoughts on the beneficial electrification piece, we'll move on to compliance adjustment. So the public feedback, again, we had about 3/4 of our survey takers in support of the adjusted compliance pathways or recommendations, and 15% that were opposed. And so we'll start with timeline adjustment. This is our recommendation as it stands. And as you might recall, this sort of section in the middle is just really a list of examples for the types of application for this timeline adjustment. Did you guys read anything or see anything in the public feedback that you think warrants discussion or potential change to this recommendation?
And I think we can review both of them together, like timeline and target.
Sure.
Sorry, I was just going to mention that somebody said they think it's like certain kinds of buildings that would get a pass. So I didn't know if there was clarifying language in here to make people understand that this is not about a certain kind of building, like a federal building that would get a pass. So that was the only comment I had.
We can add that to the recommendation document as well. When we introduce these, to ensure that's not just a certain building type, these would be eligible for all buildings to apply to, obviously.
Christine.
I think the documentation one needs to include why they are requesting an adjusted compliance option.
Okay. Kathy?
Yeah, I don't know. I just want to throw this out there, and you may say that we need to talk about this at a different time and place, and that's perfectly fine. I was just thinking about that as you were talking about building types and getting passes. One of the things that became painfully obvious when we were having our I did a presentation to NAIOP and BOMA members about the recommendations. And one of the things that it became clear was really confusing to people was the definition of an industrial building. And because in a lot of the development, they're zoned industrial, but they might be a distribution place or a warehouse, like an Amazon warehouse building would have been built as an industrial designation. So I think there's going to be a lot of confusion when people read, industrial doesn't have to comply. And I know we did that because of manufacturing more, but I think our wording may be getting us in a little bit of trouble. So that probably doesn't apply here. That's probably a more broader thing. I just didn't want to forget to mention it.
No, thank you, Kathy. That is something the Energy Office is working on in our benchmarking program of providing those definitions, which would then apply to this. So that is something we're working on internally through the rulemaking of providing more of those details under the benchmarking requirements. So thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Crystal. And thanks, Kathy. So if there aren't any other suggested changes to timeline, we'll move to target, and then we can sort of make sure that we all agree on the changes that we're detailing here. Were there any suggested changes to the target adjustment piece based on public feedback?
I think the feedback may be general enough for both of these compliance options.
Great, and we can add it all to this one. Anything additional that you guys want to cover?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Well, I think, oh, sorry.
Sorry, I was just thinking about that word all. If we could just pause a moment. I didn't have time to finish thinking, but I suppose I'll say it because we're moving on. I don't know that all buildings should be able to adjust their target. It would only be if they have a valid reason. And so they would all be eligible if they had a valid reason.
I was thinking to cover better instead of all. I mean, if you're going to put that in there, is that enable covered building owners to request or propose?
I'm going to actually jump in here, and not that we're hearing your feedback on that. I don't think that's something that needs to be specified in this language. I think that's something again that can go into the recommendations to set this up of these options are available to all covered building owners. These are not awarded based on certain property types that exempt a whole property type. So I think that background can be added to the recommendations. I don't think we need to specify all buildings or anything in the language. And Katrina and Kathy, please put your thoughts in the comments too, or in the chat too, of what you were thinking around that to make sure we specify that in the background.
And Katrina, did Crystal's response sort of capture your, okay, fantastic. Okay. Well, I'll give another sort of 15-second pause, make sure everyone's collected their thoughts and had an opportunity to share, and then we will take a vote and we'll move on.
Kimberly, since we are low on time, we have 15 minutes left. Let's move on.
Okay. Great. So do we want to do a quick vote for the one change that we made for this?
I don't think we need a quick vote on this one.
Okay. Fair enough. Moving on. So we got a lot of feedback and again, this was included in your pre-work packet on the programs to support compliance, workforce, and equity. So we pulled just a couple of those comments onto this slide for reference for folks. And so we'll share this and then we'll look at the programs to support compliance recommendation. So some thoughts we heard from the public: make resources, i.e. how-to guides, overview of goals and expectations, and help hotlines available online. Provide examples for compliance and/or handbook for building owners to reference. Ensure program documents are in clear layperson language in multiple languages and easily accessible. Provide educational programs and materials for HOAs. And provide materials that emphasize the benefits of the BPS and why building owners' efforts are worthwhile. And again, these are just a few of the many comments that we received in the survey. So hopefully you have had a chance to look at all of them. But this is our programs to support compliance recommendation. And so I'll just leave this up here so you guys can refresh yourselves on what we voted on, and then open the floor if there are any additional ideas.
And Kim, maybe something that would be helpful is that we go through the summarized feedback from the public on the programs and workforce and equity. Since we did just recently vote on these proposals, and if the task force thinks there's certain feedback from the public that was not considered or not brought into these proposals, we can stop and then put that recommendation in.
Okay. So then we'll continue on, and as you guys have ideas, feel free to stop me or raise your hands. So as far as summary of comments that we heard back on programs to support workforce, a couple of the major themes we saw were enforcing prevailing wage and labor agreements, working with schools, K-12 and higher education to recruit, provide training, certification, apprenticeship program resources, conduct demonstration projects, provide contractor-specific training, especially for HVAC contractors, and engage with industry organizations and existing experts to increase BPS knowledge and provide training programs. And then I'll just skip quickly over to the main themes for feedback related to equity considerations, ensuring building tenants are minimally impacted by the building performance standard, ensure grants, incentives, rebates, other financing mechanisms are available and accessible, especially for under-resourced buildings or communities, provide extra technical assistance to those who need it, engage with under-resourced communities to understand what resources they need, and ensure equitable access to offsite renewable resources. So understanding that the sort of full suite of feedback, we can go through these proposals one at a time. So if there are any ideas or things that we need to adjust or add to our recommendation for programs, would love to hear those thoughts. Nori.
Sorry, people are rolling their eyes because I have so many comments. But one of the items that I thought was interesting was one of the folks suggested a one-stop shop where you would understand how to do a regular compliance program, an alternative compliance program, and you'd be able to access the technical assistance and the financial incentives. So no changes to the actual programs, but the thought of putting them in some sort of a one-stop shop, I like that idea.
Yeah, great. I appreciate that, Nori. I think that could be really helpful.
You know, that's in number 5, so we agree.
Yeah, Technical Assistance Hub, I think, is what grabs that there. Thanks, Karen. Any other thoughts to share? And I know it might seem a little rushed. We don't mean to rush you guys in really being thoughtful about this. And so we hope as you all are reviewing the final recommendations, you'll have that public feedback on hand as well, and can kind of use that as a lens when you're reviewing those final recommendations and have a bit more time with it. So here's our proposal, or excuse me, recommendation for programs to support workforce. Any pieces of public feedback that came up for you all that you thought were worth sharing in this regard, or that might be worth updating or revising this proposal? Cecil. Cecil, I think you're still muted.
Sorry about that. On number 3, not all the trades out there have licenses. So I was wondering, if you could, finish with a state license or a professional license if the trade is not registered with the state? Because some counties have licenses for different trades.
And sometimes the word credential has been used to cover some of those things where you just have like, if you've gotten vocational training or experience.
And I was going to say, yeah, Lotus, make sure to highlight that in red. I believe we had a conversation around this at the last meeting around license versus certification. I'm not quite sure who brought it up on the concern of license versus certification or.
I think it was Jenny had some strong opinions on that.
Okay. And yeah, Jenny's not here. Okay.
Then I also had a couple more things there. To collaborate with and promote accredited, can we add and registered training programs?
Yeah, I think that's a great recommendation. Anything else, Cecil?
Yeah, I had one more. I'm looking for it. The preferred contractors down there. Develop a list of preferred contractors that have qualifications. Could part of the qualifications be, having the like using apprentices, apprentice utilization, just to try to get more people trained. So as you're hiring people to do the job, to make sure they're training new people to keep doing the job.
Sure. And I wonder if that could be something, and Cecil, if this, let me know if this captures it. If we say such as apprenticeship programs. So the qualifications would be to meet the BPS requirements and support workforce development by way of, as an example, an apprenticeship program.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's good to make sure that whoever's doing the work is helping train the next generation to keep doing the work.
Okay. And as we're making these changes, we would love to make sure that we're getting approval from putting this up to a vote. But before we do so, are there any other thoughts on Cecil's recommended changes or other ideas to add to this slide?
And as you guys review the recommendations, there's that opportunity as well to suggest things that were left out as you continue to review the public's feedback. But since we're adding these items in red, I would like to take a vote, agree or disagree in the chat for these recommended changes, since we did vote on this in the previous meeting.
And Crystal, quickly before we do that, Paul, did you have something you wanted to add here?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question. I recall at a previous meeting, we had a brief conversation about the meaning or definition of prevailing wage. Did you guys ever go back and look at that? I think there was some concern we didn't want to trigger things like Davis-Bacon. So what would that mean in practice? Prevailing wage as a term. And that's just a question, so.
Yeah, Paul, that's a great question. And I don't think that our team internally has circled up on that, but we can follow up with that piece. Make sure we have that definition.
Thanks for flagging that for us, Paul.
Let's take a vote in the chat to ensure that these changes are okay with everyone on the task force, and then let's get some general feedback on equity since our meeting time is wrapping up.
While you all are voting in the chat, I will say thank you for the conversation and all of the work that you've done to date. Look forward to sharing with you the draft of the full set of recommendations and the continued dialogue on that. I do have to drop off to get to another meeting, but if there are any questions that any of you have for me, please do feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, it seems like most people agree in the chat, but noting that prevailing wage still needs to be looked into. So I think we can move on to equity.
Okay. Thanks everyone for that feedback. And then finally, with our last 3 minutes, so try to think quickly here, if there's anything that you guys wanted to change based on the feedback we received in our public survey for programs to support equity.
I'll just note that this one has prevailing wage in it also, so maybe you could just flag it.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks for that, Karen.
I see folks are still reading, so I'll just give it one more moment.
Kim, I think we can move on to the next steps and remind everyone of the timeline.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for your feedback. And again, if there's anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to chat about or include in the recommendations per the public feedback, make sure to include that as you do the review of the first draft of recommendations. So just to wrap us up, again, we talked about this timeline at the beginning, but we will be sending you all a draft of the full set of recommendations from the task force on Wednesday, August 10th. You will have 7 business days to review and provide your comments on that draft. And we'll ask that you send us any comments back by Friday, August 19th. And we're going to be really strict on that deadline because we only have a short time frame to turn that all of your comments around into a final draft. So please be very mindful of that. And we'll remind you again when we send out the recommendations what that timeline looks like. September 7th, between August 19th and September 7th, we will finalize the recommendations per your feedback and send it back to you all on September 7th for a final review. We will ask that you bring any of your final concerns to our last task force meeting on September 14th. We will not be collecting responses via email unless there are extenuating circumstances, and of course, let us know if that's the case. And then we will go through September 14th. At September 14th, we will review all final comments from you all on the recommendations, and we'll use that really to tie a bow on our work together here. So Nori, to answer your question, the public comment period is now closed. So yeah, as Crystal said, the AQCC will be doing another round of public comment when the rules are published. And so that's all we've got for the day. I really appreciate, again, all of your time and energy being here today. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your Wednesday afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you.